I just got back from South Padre Island. It's June, which means it's 101 degrees outside, but it's also Milky Way season. While I was there on the first night, we had quite a bit of cloud cover blowing through, which actually I shot a time lapse of because I thought it'd be cool. But it turns out there's quite a few frames I really like as individual Milky Way photos, so I thought I would walk through an edit of those. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've pulled some of the frames. There's a couple hundred frames because it's an overnight time lapse, but I pulled a set of the frames in that have the images I want. So the way you'd start, you should import the photos into Capture One. That's all I was editing with collections earlier. Okay, just import those into the main catalog. I've got a catalog for this demo set up. And if we flip through these are straight out of camera. You can see that looks like I probably locked the truck or something and the parking lights blinked. So I can go through these. And I really like some of these where the clouds are blowing through. Pick one of those that has nice clouds in it and the Milky Way visible. So probably don't belabor it too much. That one right there. Okay. So the basic plan we're going to work under here is I'm going to pick one. I'm going to just hit 1 star on this one so I can find it easily again. With anything that involves potentially stacking photos, I edit one and then I apply to all the photos. My basic edit scheme for this one is going to be that I'm going to adjust it in Capture One, get it looking the way I want, sync all the photos, and then because I'm shooting at a very high ISO, very low light conditions, literally the only light out here is starlight, there's no moon, there's not a lot of light pollution, so it's very dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the fact that I have a whole lot of frames that are exactly the same for most of the frame, the bottom for example, to reduce the amount of noise in the foreground. And then I'm going to use another trick to reduce the amount of noise in the clouds. So let's start by doing a little base adjustment here. First thing I do is I usually work on leveling, just because no matter how much I try, especially with a wide angle lens, it's never quite level. Now, go over here to my exposure panel. My interface is not completely factory stock because I have white balance and stuff on here. You can customize Capture One. Right click on this panel, you can add whatever tools you want to add. So I've tuned this panel to have just about everything I use at any one time. So I think I want to play with the white balance a little bit. A little exposure. Now, one of the things I do quite a bit of is level adjusts. So now there's things I'd like to do to the sky and the ground separately. So I'm going to go ahead and tackle those using adjustment layers. This is a pretty classic case of gradient tool working really well. Graduated neutral density filter virtually. So this may seem odd that I'm reducing the exposure and then bringing the shadow compensation up. It tends to reduce the amount of vignetting and such, which 1424, Nikon 1424 does have vignetting at 2.8. If I remove this, you'll notice how when I increase the contrast, how much darker the corners are. That's the vignetting coming in. And just about any lens, especially a zoom lens, will have vignetting wide open. And so by using the shadow compensation, I can bring that up. I could also use the any vignetting tool on the whole image, but this is fine here. I'm also going to apply some area-specific noise reduction above and beyond the default. By increasing the contrast, we have a lot of noise in these clouds, and we're going to deal with that in another way in a minute as well, but it doesn't hurt to add a little bit of noise reduction just to help there. I'm gonna go ahead. Another thing I tend to do on stars is I'll bring the clarity and the structure down. So clarity and structure both have to do with local contrast and sharpening. And one thing I don't want with my astro images is I don't want them to be over sharp. So if you watch zoomed in, watch what happens to the outline of the stars. So it gets super local contrasty, and there's actually a little black line showing up around here. That's clarity. So as I go negative, you'll see that get much softer. So now it's got kind of a creamy, dreamlike feeling. Don't want to go quite that far. And structure is a much finer control, and this is actually what I would call much more like classic sharpening, even though we can also do sharpening here. And you see how crunchy everything looks at 400%. So I'll zoom out a little bit here, get a better idea of what, and just back that off a little bit, and it just makes things a little softer. So if I reset that, it just softens it just a little bit. Okay. Let's go ahead and do a ground-based adjustment. This is something I'll often do. I'll add 2 graduated filters that cover essentially the same area. And the reason I do that is because while I could just have the one for the sky and then everything, when I change the everything one, it changes the sky also. So I tend to get my base background layer the way I want it. And then I just apply graduated filters to each area, which lets me then tweak them without having to affect everything. So when I go back to that background layer, I have to then adjust every other layer again. Whereas with this scheme, I don't really have to do that. And it may seem like I'm doing a lot of things that are fairly similar here, bringing up some shadow detail, increasing the contrast just a little bit. Little bit of exposure. And that's probably okay right there. So what I'm doing right here with the levels, this is a tool that's not directly present in Lightroom. You can do it in Photoshop or Affinity or anywhere else. And you can accomplish the same thing using the black, whites, shadows, and highlights. I like this interface a little bit better, personally. And what I'm doing right here is I'm setting what value in the histogram equates to black. So everything to the left of this is going to be full black. Everything to the right of this will be full white. And this midpoint sets, essentially it's like doing this. So, you know, I'm accomplishing similar things with the curve as well. So if I can reset this, and then I can do just a little bit more here, and it does about the same thing. So I do quite a bit of editing with the exposure panel and this panel only. Okay, so I think that's a reasonable start. It's a little noisy. Let's go. I want to turn the noise reduction up just a little bit. I'm not going to do all that much. We've pumped the contrast in the sky, which is where you're getting the noise in the clouds. So now I'm going to hit Control Shift C, Command Shift C for Mac users, which is what I'm using, and then Command Shift V, and it will apply it to all the frames in the set. Okay, so now that's pretty reasonable right off the bat. A little bit of noise in the sky and such. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select a set of these. I'm not going to export this one because I'm going to bring all these together in Affinity and clean up the noise. If you see how noisy everything is down here, I'm going to clean up this noise using stacking. So I'm going to skip any frames that have big flares in them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if I scroll down here, that's good. So that's every frame I exported, or rather imported in this case, except for this first frame. So now we're going to go to our recipe panel. I've got an Affinity recipe panel open. I I'm actually going to use that. The reason I'm going to use that is it will put them all in the right place because I've got the export set up to go the right place for this. It's going to open them all in Affinity. I don't actually want them all open, but I can close them again and then do what I want to do. So, okay, so now we wait for a second. So you notice there are like 20 photos here. I'm actually just going to close all of these. I'm going to open one of these. And I'm going to open the one I want to be my base file. Probably that one right there. So, all right, so I've got these nice streaming clouds. I've got the Milky Way sort of front and center. Actually, I don't think I'm going to use that one because you'll notice there's kind of clouds over this area. So what I want is I want the galactic core to be quite clear. Let's try that one, 28. That's pretty good. This is completely clear. Okay, so now here's my base photo. New stack, add images, visitor screen, select all the images I exported. Normally I would image align these, but for a case like this, the camera's on a tripod, there is no movement. I'm using a super sturdy Gitzo tripod that does not move. I could totally stack these as a star trail and that wouldn't be any issue. So I'm not gonna align them. That just uses up time, and it also may freak out because there's so much movement in the top half of the frame. The clouds are moving and the stars are moving. I'm not sure if it'll align it or not. Don't really care, don't need it. Okay, so we're gonna import those. Okay, so those came in, and we're doing median blending, which is kind of cool on its own. Median and mean. So mean is the average. So I don't know how many people remember their grade school math. Mean means to take the average. So this is taking the average of all the frames. Median is finding the middle point of all the frames. And then there's other mathematical relationships you can do here. Maximum is basically light and only. Minimum is basically dark and only. Okay, so anyways, there's all these things. We're going to do mean. So what we've just done is we've averaged the data from all those frames. You may think, well, now the sky is all, blotchy. Well, that's fine. So I'm going to copy the Control A, Command A, Command C. And I'm going to go back to my base plate here, and I'm just going to paste this in. So now I've got this live stack here. I'm sure there's a way to add it directly. I just do it in a new one and copy and paste it over. Okay, so I'm using this primarily for the foreground. Okay, so if you look here, if I turn this on and off, see how crunchy it gets? But with it on, I've got a much smoother foreground. Okay, I've created a mask. I can go over here. I'm with the mask selected, so you see it's got a white box around it. I'm going to do a gradient. Now by default, Affinity does from white to middle gray for some reason. Never understood that. It's probably a way to change it. So I'm going to go from white to black. And you'll notice, because this is basically the same data, what we can do here is we can be really abrupt. And if I'm not straight, you can watch the line of sharpness go across the screen. So one way to make sure you're absolutely level, assuming your horizon is level, is to hold on the Shift key, and then it locks this to 45-degree angles, which can be kind of nice. So that's going to be rather abrupt. And you'll notice, whoops. Let go of Shift before I let go of the mouse. Okay, so now you'll notice that this is pretty smooth and this is really crunchy. But we've now cleaned up the foreground. And so if I turn this off, I'm basically turning off the foreground. Another neat effect is that we have these nice, long, even rows of waves, which I kind of like, being super regular. The beach has got lots of seaweed on it. You know, it is eventually you're photographing what you're photographing. So if I turn that off, you can see the top come back in. Anyways, just basic masking. Okay. Should you have a frame in here you accidentally exported that was a joker, you can turn off individual frames. Super easy. And you could play with that if you wanted to. This image doesn't require it. Okay, so there's that. So now I'm going to rename this original. I'm going to duplicate it. And then I'm going to go up here to filter frequency separation. So now I'm going to deal with some of the noise in the sky. If you haven't realized this yet, you can pan around an image in most applications, Capture One, Affinity, Photoshop, etc., by holding down the space key and then just click and drag. So if you look here, I'm zoomed in pretty tight. And the left side is my high frequency layer, and the right side is my low frequency layer. So what I'm looking for is the low frequency layer to be smooth. For those of you who haven't used frequency separation before, what it does is it takes rapid changes in the image and puts them on one layer, and slow changes in the image, low frequency changes, and puts them on a different layer. Now I can use that as a way to essentially noise reduce certain areas in the image selectively, because I can mask in the frequency layer, the high frequency layer, in the areas that I want that lots of data, or I can mask it out in areas where I don't. So you can see if this is basically a Gaussian blur over here on the right. So there it is at 100 pixel radius. And all the data is over here, and this is just a smear of color. Well, that's too much. I can go down to 2 pixels, which is the default, and you'll notice there's still a lot of noise here. That's how I can do that, about like that. I can go pretty far. Now, this is an interesting checkbox, feature protection tolerance. This really makes frequency separation something used for noise reduction. In some cases, it works really well. You can adjust what it considers to be a quote-unquote feature. In other words, things not to put on the high frequency layer, even though they look like they're high frequency. What you'll notice is all the stars stayed here, even though I've got with this turned off, they'll all jump over here, because those are what it thinks are significant frequency shifts. Anyways, in this scenario, I'm not actually going to use that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go as small on the radius as I can, in order to make the blur as little as I can. And I'm looking at this cloud right here, because that's actually what I'm going to use this for, is the horizon and the clouds. I'm not using it for the stars. So you see how the stars are just completely gone? Not going to matter. Okay? We apply that, and that layer that we had selected turns into a high frequency and a low frequency layer. I'm going to group those and call that background. There we go. Actually, let's call it sky. Okay. So now I'm going to add a mask to my high frequency layer, and I'm going to invert that mask, and you'll see that everything gets blurry because I basically mask out the entire layer. I'm going to invert it again, leave it all there. In this case, I'm going to work by subtracting the high frequency layer from the areas I want to be soft. So I'm going to grab my brush. I'm going to make sure it's 0% hard, very soft. So if you click on the title and drag left and right, you can change these values. You can also put your mouse over it and scroll the wheel. Super easy there. In this case, I'm going to go 100% opacity, 0% hardness. And you'll notice when the brush goes over things, see how it gets blurry in the center of the brush? So I'm effectively doing a blur here, but it's a very selective blurring, and it's masking based, so I can remove it easily. The left and right square bracket keys give me the ability to change the size of the brush easily. Control Z there because that get kind of a little aggressive. Okay. So now if we look, if you've decided, oh, I painted over something I shouldn't paint over, flip to your white brush and just bring it back in. Okay. Okay, so now if I drag, I'm going to drag the original up to the top. So here's where we started coming out of capture 1. Okay, so there's where we started. There's where we ended up. And it's a subtle difference. I wish the beach was cleaner, honestly, but this is what the Texas beach looks like in the summer. Lots of seaweed. And this is not noise-free, and I'm not really going for noise-free. I could make it look really plasticky if I wanted, but the noise is something we're used to seeing there. So let's say I wanted to reduce that a little further. I could just go down here, and there is a noise filter. So what I was doing here is very specific noise reduction, very targeted noise reduction. Denoise filter, there we go. And this is at the top of this layer stack, so it's going to apply to everything below it. So without clicking the extreme box, I can do that. If I click the extreme box, I can go really crazy. And it gets very, very painterly, a little more than I'd like. The danger with noise reduction, and the reason I like to be a little more specific, is that you can effectively remove details and things that are looking really plastic. So I'm gonna be somewhat conservative there. See, if you look at this, the clouds are starting to get really, really plasticky from my point of view. A quick way to test what you're doing there. So if I turn this off, I go to 0% on the opacity of the denoise layer. We go back to where we were. So as I turn this up to 100%, I like what that's doing with the sky. So it turns out every adjustment layer in Affinity is also a mask layer. So you notice it was white to begin with, and I hit Control I or Command I, which inverts it. So I just went back to white. And you notice everything got smooth again. Control I, invert, go back to black. So I made that mask layer black. Now I can use the same strategy I used for the clouds. I'm going to paint white over just the areas I want to do noise reduction on. Let's turn my opacity up to 100%. Just do it one time. Okay. So there is some of that noise reduction. That's a little bit more plastic looking than I really would like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the opacity on this layer down, which is a quick, easy way to change its strength. Okay. So there we go. So there's where we came out of the camera. This is what it looked like. There it is out of capture one, quite a bit of noise. And then there it is processed through Affinity using a image stack to noise reduce the foreground. And some other techniques, frequency separation for the clouds, and then just a straight up denoise filter in Affinity for the sky. And there's lots of other stuff you could do to this image. Sometimes I spend a lot of time fiddling with things just to, you know, what I want it to look like. You know, you could certainly do a curve adjust and make the sky more dramatic if you wanted. Let me bring it just a little bit. There we go. Okay. So these are all adjustment layers. So if I can delete this layer super easy. I can undelete it super easy. It's a mask layer. You can do whatever you want. So anyways, there you go. So I hope you enjoyed that. Click subscribe. Publish quite a few of these sister screens going forward as I shoot more. Really, goal for this next year is to do a lot more YouTube work and share more stuff. So anyways, see you later.